In this video, I would like to talk about the story 55 Miles to the Gas Pump, which was written by Proulx. The story consists of 3 sentences. The first and second sentences each are pretty, sizable paragraphs each, and each paragraph reveals information about one of the characters. So in the first paragraph, we have information about Rancher Proulx and what he's doing. In the second paragraph, we have information about Mrs. Proulx and what she is doing. The final paragraph or sentence gives some commentary on what we have just witnessed as readers in the rest of the story. So I want to make some points about this story that I think we need to think about. I do have some notes here I kind of want to look at as I'm talking about the story. But the story seems to be working on more than just the obvious level of revealing a narrative about a man who committed terrible acts and his wife who, for whatever reason, didn't turn him in and didn't go into that space, the space that belonged to him, until after she thought he was gone. So again, I think the story is working on more than just that obvious level. So we have the story that I just mentioned, obviously what is taking place. Rancher Proulx leaves the house. He, as it says, gallops across the plain. He goes to a canyon and he jumps off the canyon, I believe to intentionally commit suicide. And Mrs. Proulx, we don't know how long after which he has departed that she is on the roof. It seems sort of, just the description of her is rather cartoonish and amusing. I almost imagine that as soon as she sees that he's far enough that he can't tell what she's doing, she's up on the roof with the saw. But anyway, she's sawing a hole in the roof because she wants in that attic, and he told her not to go in there. The word warnings is used, padlocks and warnings. I can't help but think that he has threatened her. He's threatened her that she is not permitted to go in that attic. Who knows what he has threatened her with, but anybody who would do what Rancher Proulx, we find out, has been doing, she would be totally validated in being afraid of his warnings. The subject matter of this story is disturbing. There's no way around that. Even if we are at times amused by the descriptions, for example, the description of Rancher Proulx, what he physically looks like and how he is behaving, or even the image of Mrs. Proulx on the roof, those are amusing, but we cannot get away from the fact that the overall subject matter of the story is horrific. It's disturbing. We don't want to confuse the subject matter with the tone that the writer is taking in this story. So we might be disturbed, we might feel horrified at what is taking place, but that would be mood, that would not be tone. So in order to derive the tone of the story, you have to think about situations like word choice, the way the sentences are structured, the sort of moments wherein you have funny turns of phrase, okay, things like that. So we can look at a few examples of those. So I'm thinking about word choice, okay, and one of the first instances I see is just the description of Rancher Proulx. Now, maybe this is exactly how he looks, but also, she could have chosen different words to describe him, and he's described as wall-eyed, and his hair like curling fiddle string ends. She could have described it a different way, but she chooses to use words that really ground us in that environment. But also, that's probably what his hair looks like. We also have the description of toward the end of that part where he's being described, where he goes over the edge, and then it says, but before he hits, he rises again to the top of the cliff like a cork in a bucket of milk. So just that sort of farm rural imagery, the cork rising, okay, like in a bucket of milk. Okay, so that goes very much with sort of rural farm life. You find buckets of milk on a farm, you might find corks, okay? It seems to me that the narrator is describing exactly how, even if it's using metaphorical language, it's describing how Rancher Proulx looks and his behavior and what is happening. There's no sense of the narrator feeling saddened by Rancher Proulx's suicide. There's no feeling of impending doom, like, oh, he's writing out here, what is he going to do? It's just sort of matter-of-factly described there. Even if some of the language is metaphorical, it's explaining what is happening. And if anything, it's rather humorous, sort of darkly humorous. Likewise, the description of what Mrs. Proulx finds in the attic is equally rather unemotional, sort of matter-of-fact. I mean, the description of the bodies is given there, and it seems pretty matter-of-fact that how they were wrapped up and how their skin was dried out, the comparison to some desiccated as jerky. So the simile there it's used, and then just the description of how the bodies have been there. Some of them are moldy, some of them have been leaked on by a leak in the roof. So who knows how long they've been there. Some of them have paint on them, and the paint was what was used to paint the shutters years ago. Gives you the idea that they've been there for a long time. And then there's this alliteration here, one wrapped in newspaper, nipple to knee, which is, it strikes me as humorous. Alliteration gets our attention. Often it can be humorous. Sometimes, you'll see these stories with a lot of alliteration, and it sort of downplays the seriousness of the subject matter or the content because of the alliteration. So it draws your attention to it, but also, I think, lends a sense of amusement or comedy to it. So just those word choices are interesting. Also, another word choice, and this is Mrs. Proulx's attitude about it. She sees these bodies up there, the corpses, it says, just as she thought, the corpses of Mr. Proulx's paramours. So if you look up the word paramour, well, you might want to look up the word paramour. I'll give you a moment to look it up. The meaning of paramour is really important. It lends something to our understanding of Mrs. Proulx. Okay, so a secret or illicit lover. Secret or illicit. So he's not supposed to be, having a romantic sexual relationship with these women. It's in secret. It's a violation of his marriage vows. But what is interesting about that is that these women likely did not consent to this. So a lover, a paramour, is somebody who, they're like willingly involved in this love affair. And these women, I would venture to say that these women did not have a choice in that. Maybe he engaged with them physically after they were even dead, after they were dead. So, okay, I doubt that there's consent going on there. But yet Mrs. Proulx treats these women and looks at them, regards them as if they are rivals, his secret lovers, his paramours. Tells us a little bit about Mrs. Proulx. As I mentioned earlier, an interesting word choice is jerky. Okay, now, a lot of you commented when you were talking about the story that one of the most disturbing descriptions to you was that comparison, okay? And I think that, Proulx knew what she was doing when she wrote the story. She knew that was a disgusting description. But that word is helping us to understand not only what the whole point of the story is, which I will venture into later, but it's helping us grasp the disgusting vision that Mrs. Proulx has before her here, And it's also very, I think, an honest, as I mentioned before, an honest description. That's what they look like. Okay, that's what the bodies look like. Some of them do, like jerky. And that's the best comparison that the person who is taking in the information, which is probably Mrs. Proulx at that point, it's kind of that what we're seeing is kind of filtered through, I guess, her perception. So the idea of jerky is interesting because jerky is food, but yet here we have a human body being compared to food. We need to think about how that is particularly relevant to Rancher Proulx. What is Rancher Proulx doing with these women? What is his attitude toward these women? Okay, I think it's very astute, very clever, actually, that Proulx uses the comparison of these women's bodies to jerky. Then we have that final statement at the end of the story, and some of you have said that you think this is Mrs. Proulx's perception. I'm not convinced that it's Mrs. Proulx's perception. One reason is that a new paragraph has started, and I feel like if this was a continuation of Mrs. Proulx's perception, it would still be in the preceding paragraph. I almost feel like it might be the narrator here, just coming in and commenting on the situation, this horrific situation, and trying to make sense of it. When you live a long way out, you make your own fun. So some of you provided in the DNR your idea that maybe the story is saying that isolation, drives people to boredom and then drives people to do, commit behaviors like this out of boredom, out of being separated from other people, and maybe being separated from, the kinds of laws and rules that would otherwise prevent them from behaving in this way. So one of my questions, or I guess one of my ideas, and I kind of formulated two questions out of it, was, is the story saying one or the other? So does isolation make people kill other people? Does it make people, behave in this brutal way toward other people? Or does isolation drive people to do or behave in a way that is already within them to do anyway? So does the isolation just give them an opportunity to behave in a way that they kind of always wanted to, or that they're inclined to behave based on their nature? So I think that's kind of what the story is asking us to think about. And in a way, it's sort of, I think it's a sarcastic statement. When you live a long way out, you make your own fun. Of course, if you're someone who values human life and believes that, people should not murder each other, then your idea is going to think that's a crazy sort of thing to say. That's a really awful attitude to embrace. And I remember the first time I read the story, I remember laughing when I got to the end of it, because I'm like, not that I thought it was funny, but I was just so disturbed and thought, wow, that's such a preposterous notion, So for me, when I read it, the story was working in multiple ways. I just didn't realize it until I analyzed it. So not only is it asking us to, think about what does isolation do and what is the story saying about the effect that isolation has on people, it's also asking us to examine our own ideas and presumptions about some of the people in this story and about culture in general. And I'll explain what I mean by that. First, let me draw your attention to the fact that in this textbook, this story is listed in the section entitled A Thematic Case Study, Humor and Satire. So why would a story that contains this kind of graphic and brutal subject matter, why would it be categorized as humorous or satirical? Why? What does satire do? So that's something you should consider. What does satire do? Let me read from the dictionary. I'm looking at the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it says that satire is a literary work holding up human vices and follies to ridicule or scorn. So we have to ask, what is this author ridiculing? What is this author making fun of? I would think it's safe to say that we can see a few human vices here that might be being made fun of, possibly. The sort of murderous desire that some people have. The desire to control others, right? Rancher Proulx doesn't want her to go in that attic. And he also pretty much has the run of the whole place. I mean, the attic is his. She can't go in there. The cellar basically is his because he likes to brew beer down there. So the only place that Mrs. Proulx actually seems to be in where she's supposed to be, and it's not even talked about, is the rest of the house, like the middle of the house. So, the desire for dominance. But there's something else that I think is being brought up as well. And that could be the desire that some people have, and I would say that all of us tend to have, a morbid curiosity about dark subjects. Not that we enjoy necessarily reading about it, but to some degree we are curious, whether it's we're asking ourselves, how could somebody do something like that? Or, we think about what victims might have gone through. Okay, so just this intense, the fact that we're drawn to subject matter like this as human beings, whether it's through our empathy with victims, okay, or just the idea of, understanding somebody who could commit something like this, or, wondering how they could do it, okay. So the human curiosity factor, I suppose, is what I'm driving at here. I feel as if the work is kind of asking us to examine ourselves, our own reactions when we read this, because at moments we might chuckle at some of the descriptions, but then we might turn around and feel bad about doing that because the subject matter is so terrible, and we know that real things like this do happen in the world. So there's this sense of an incongruity between the humor that we see in the story, in some of the descriptions, and the subject matter, and an incongruity between the subject matter and the tone. And so I think it just sort of highlights for us that sense of ambivalence. How are we supposed to feel about the people in this story? How are we supposed to feel about the potential for isolation to bring out the worst in people? How are we supposed to feel about the potential that most of us probably have to hurt somebody if we thought we needed to? But what about those people who do it just for fun? Okay, so the story brings up many interesting aspects. On the one hand, our empathy probably is evoked for these victims. On the other hand, we're given the statement like, the justification when you live a long way out, you make your own fun, which we have to grapple with in a moral way. So if you thought that this story was confusing, or you felt torn when you were reading it and you have conflicting feelings about it, I think that that's normal. But I think that then requires you to dig deeper into the story and to try to figure out what is the tone here, what is being made fun of. I feel like there's something about our own society that Proulx is poking fun at. Also the fact that we who are not Rancher Proulx or Mrs. Proulx, those of us who are standing outside this story and who might feel like we're better than Rancher Proulx and Mrs. Proulx, we're being asked to consider, is this a morality that makes sense to us? And could it be true of somebody who doesn't live on a ranch? What about the isolation of living in a large city, a large anonymous city, and we feel alone, or we feel like